Hello everyone and welcome to this Tortoise Thinking, part of the Tortoise Education Summit. My name's Polly Curtis. I'm an editor and partner at Tortoise. And the question we're asking in this thinking is, should we abolish exams? For me, the moment when I realized that coronavirus was really going to change everything was when they said the exams weren't going to go ahead. It boggled our minds that this could happen. And yet it also opened up this space in which we could ask, is this the best way to assess human ability? So we've got some fantastic speakers, but to recap on this format, this is a Tortoise Thinking, and you in the audience are all speakers, and we're going to be calling on you to share your ideas, your opinions, your evidence to help us answer this question. There are two ways you can get involved in the conversation. You can raise your digital hand. If you click on participants, you'll see a little grey button pop up, and that's how you raise your digital hand. But you can also leave your comments in the chat, and I'd love to bring you into the conversation from there. So just before I introduce the first of our speakers, we ran a poll which some of our guests really hated because it was binary, and it would be for that reason, but I hope this conversation will get to a much more nuanced kind of conversation around the purpose of exams. And we're just looking at the results here, and we asked, do exams do more harm than good? And 54% of you agreed, 56% disagreed. So that makes for an interesting discussion, because I think that says that there's a lot of nuance in that space. There was new research out this week done by Santander, who surveyed all their students across the 14 countries that they work in. And of those students, 90% said exams weren't the best way of judging someone's ability for a job. So there's definitely not enough, there's not a huge amount of belief in the exam system at the moment, but there's also not a shared narrative around what could replace it. I'm delighted to invite the first of our speakers, Professor Dylan William, who's Emeritus Professor of Educational Assessment at UCL Institute of Education. He's also the hero of the day, because I think it is an ungodly hour in Florida where Dylan now is, and I have managed to convince him to get out of bed for us. So thank you very much, Dylan, for joining us. And Dylan, when we were prepping for this call, you stopped me in my tracks by saying, well, what are exams for? Which was something I'd assumed. And can you unpack that a bit for us? What are exams for? And do you think this is a serious question? Could we abolish exams?
Well, when I first heard your question, should we abolish exams, my initial reaction was I thought I'd be saying no, but. As I began to think about this, I became more and more confused and less convinced that I knew what the answer was. And in the end, I almost convinced myself that I could not countenance change because things were bad enough as they are. But I decided that I would try to address the question by taking a step back and pointing out that what are exams for? Well, they're presumably meant to assess what it is our students are learning. In other words, our assessments should be the servant of the curriculum rather than the other way around. And that was very clear in the original school certificate begun in 1917. It was meant to follow the existing school curriculum, not dominate it. But as we've gone on, my argument is that I think there are four reasons to educate people. There's personal empowerment, there's cultural transmission, passing on civilization from one generation to the next, there's preparation for democratic citizenship, and there's preparation for the world of work. And my argument is that one of these purposes, in fact, one part of one of these purposes, has come to completely dominate the entire work of schools. So this idea of sorting and ranking students for the purpose of university education has come to dominate the work of schools. So I think our school examination systems address two questions. One is, what should we assess? And the other is, what evidence should we use? And I think those two questions often get mixed up. So I want to take them apart. So what should we assess? Well, we have a curriculum, but I do think that the amount of stress we place on GCSE is an increasingly irrelevant punctuation mark in a 5 to 19 curriculum. So I think the idea of public examinations at the age of 16 made some sense when we had most students leaving school at 16, leaving education at 16 or even 15. As we now begin to plan an education for 5 to 19 and beyond, I think we need to think differently. I'm not convinced that college is for everybody. I think we probably maybe even sending too many young people to college right now. So I'm not sure university is right for everybody. I am sure that in the future, young people will need skills beyond what they could acquire by the age of 18, 19. And so the question is, what kind of assessment will serve that system best? I think that the starting point here is, like the American system, we should separate out selection from placement. So in Britain, you can only apply to university in general by applying to a particular department. You apply to do mathematics at Exeter. In other words, the process of selection for the university and placement into a particular program are combined. In American universities, that doesn't happen. In American universities, you apply to university and then you begin a broad range of studies, and you identify your major in the second, maybe even the third year. And I think our narrow specialization in the UK is actually not serving us well. We need a broader education system. So I would like to see our curriculum for 16 to 19 broadened. And we tried that with AS levels and it didn't work. So I think we should actually have a much broader range of subjects assessed at A level or its replacement, and people required to study at least half a dozen subjects rather than being allowed to specialize. In terms of where the evidence should come from, I've now become convinced that any assessment system should be synoptic, distributed, manageable, and trusted. So let me unpack those. So our system in Britain is synoptic. We require students to assemble all the stuff that they know at the end of an exam course, and we take an exam and we collect all the evidence at the end of the course. And that has strengths because you're synthesizing everything the students have learned. But of course, it's very ineffective because you're relying on a very narrow range of data collection techniques. In America, for example, they rely a lot on a high school grade point average. And the problem with that is it's distributed. Your grade point average is based on all the work you do over your last 4 years at school, but there's no requirement to synthesize, to draw things together. So you can actually learn stuff, get a grade, and then forget everything you needed to get the grade. So I think there's a trade-off here. And I think we've gone too far one way towards the exams. We tried coursework in GCSE, and the real problem with coursework in GCSE was it was never really coursework. Coursework was an added on, bolted on extra onto everything else. Whereas I think what we should have been doing was just assessing the coursework the students did, the day-to-day stuff that students did. So the system I envisage is that we have schools up to the age of 18 teaching children what it is that we think they need to learn, a broad and balanced curriculum. And we don't do the university's grading and classification work for them. The idea is that the assessment system at the end of compulsory or post-compulsory education up to 18 should be determined by consortia of schools or maybe multi-academy trusts. So we have something much more like the high school diploma. Universities, in turn, should then use multiple methods for determining candidates' suitability. So in the United States, for example, we find that some universities have now dispensed with a scholastic aptitude test. They just use grades, school grades. And what is really interesting to me is school grades and the traditional aptitude test, the SAT, predict college performance equally well. So what I envisage is a situation very much like the Swedish system, where a candidate can put forward a case for admission to a university on any one of a number of different bases. You could pull forward your school grades if that's what gets you the best chance of getting in. You could put forward a score on an aptitude test. You could put forward your score on examinations. So the idea is that we wouldn't abolish examinations, but the important point is the the examination result would not be determinative in terms of university entrance. And just to close with one example, we did that at King's College London in 2001 with the Access to Medicine project. We had the largest medical school in Europe, but we weren't recruiting young people from Lambeth, Lewisham, and Southwark. So what we did was we identified a different way of finding talent. We used science reasoning tasks to find out whether students could learn science quickly. We benchmarked them on existing medical students, so we wouldn't be accused of dumbing down. And then we offered those students additional support because they often didn't have the A-level content knowledge in chemistry, for example, that students through more traditional routes were able to display. And the interesting thing was, by the end of their medical studies, these students were indistinguishable from the ones who had come in through the traditional routes. So what I'm arguing for is we should not abolish exams, but they shouldn't be the only way that a student can demonstrate their potential for higher education or for particular kinds of employment.
Dylan, thank you so much for that. I mean, quite a lot to unpack in there. The thing I was really, systems, the curriculums, the purpose, they're part of a broader system, so they don't operate in isolation. And being very clear about what the purpose of the exam is. I'm going to come back to you in a minute, Dylan, if that's all right. But I just wanted to hear from Peter Gumbel. So Peter Gumbel is a Brit in France who has written about the French education system, which is very exam and very exam heavy. Peter, can you tell us what your position is on this?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Sorry. We're just hearing that. So just to explain to everyone, we're hearing that Virgin has gone down. So that might affect quite a few people, including my broadband here. So bear with us if there are kind of slow moments. But Peter, we can hear you now. So let's crack on.
Thank you very much, and Polly, you're right. I mean, exams are incredibly important in France, even more important, I think, in France than in many other countries, because until recently, first of all, they didn't want to have coursework, it didn't count. And secondly, the exams, particularly the baccalaureate, is determinant for your future, for your career. Routes.
Okay, I think.
Hello. Did you get any of that?
Peter.
Hello.
I didn't, but it might be me. Could you have another
go? So I was just saying that in France, exams are incredibly important. They determine so much of your life. If you don't have the baccalaureate, the equivalent of GCSEs, there are very few jobs you can actually do. And then later on in your career, if you want to really become a civil servant, or if you want to get a good job, you need to go through these very competitive exam systems to get into a very good graduate school or a business school, for example. And the argument for exams that the French like to give is that it's more of a meritocracy than coursework. The American system, you have to do if you want to go to university, you have to write this kind of grandiose personal statement and so on. A lot of that is subjective. The French have liked to say for a long time that actually, if you have exams, everybody takes the same exams. You remove the subjectivity, and you can assess people more fairly. Now, that isn't true because we have sociological studies that show there's a distinction between classes and so on in terms of where you go to school makes all the difference and so on, what your background is makes a difference. But they've long stuck to this idea. And
Yeah, we've got another freeze. I tell you what, let's come back to Peter. Peter, we're just going to pause while we see whether we can get a better line for you. I know that our third speaker, Daisy Christodoulou, from the organisation No More Mocking, is also having horrendous Wi-Fi issues. So we're going to come back to them in a minute, but I know that there's some of our audience already got their hands in the air. So Russell Wellbeing, can we find Russell? Russell, are we?
Hello.
Oh, there you are. Brilliant. Hi, Russell. Hello.
Hi there.
Introduce yourself and share the thoughts you were having.
Yes, so I am actually a politics graduate who went to do 2 weeks of work experience to see if I wanted to do a PGCE, and by the end of my first week I was made a cover supervisor. By the end of my second week I was just given the full-time role of maths teacher with no training, qualification or experience in teaching or maths. I was thinking about in terms of these assessments, and I think the question when we look at it in terms of are assessments good or bad, I think we've really got to look at the way in which they are being used, the way in which they're being promoted. Now, to me, I think a lot of that is done through the Ofsted channels. Ofsted implements sort of a top-down pressure on exam results with devastating consequences for those exam results not being high enough. This puts pressure on head teachers put pressure on middle leaders put pressure on teachers put pressure on students. The entire system, from my understanding of well-being and the things that govern well-being, is that for the students who are achieving, this gives them anxiety. What if in the next exam I don't achieve? For the students who aren't achieving, this gives worthlessness. They are being repeatedly told, you are not good enough, you can't do this, you are going to fail. And I think we need to move towards a low stakes assessment model, and we need to move Ofsted to an advisory body. Ofsted has such a wealth of experience, such a wealth of knowledge. They could be using that to coach and support failing schools, and failing schools would be much more willing to contact them if they knew that they would get support and they didn't have a risk of their entire school getting shut down. I know that I had a low ability maths class from end of year 8 all the way through to year 11. And I had to work phenomenally hard just to get them to believe that any of it was worth doing, because in year 8, they didn't know their times tables and they just got used to failing.
God, that's really depressing, Russell. That's a really
sorry.
No. I mean, it's true. So it's important to say. And I think, but the point you're making around the fudging of the purpose of the test, whether it's for that individual's kind of progress in life or whether it's for an institutional accountability and understanding of the wider system, is really important to raise at this point. Should we try going back to Peter? I'm sorry we've had problems with the Wi-Fi, but Peter, do you want to pick up where we lost you?
Yeah, I don't know whether you got any of that at all. I'll very quickly, in France, as I was saying, very exam heavy, very much focusing on that final exam at school, the baccalaureate, and it's determinant for so much in life about you can't get very basic jobs without some sort of school leaving certificate. And more than that, even, they have these very competitive exams to get into graduate schools, the elite schools, which then lead to really good jobs in later life. So one of the arguments that the French make, which is interesting, is that it's a meritocracy, that if you have exams, everybody has an equal chance. And that if you do a system which is more reliant on coursework, that's less the case. That actually you can have a fair amount of bias and subjectivity creeping in to who gets into where because of the way it's marked. However, I mean, having said that, one of the things about the French system is the marking system is around selection. As as Dylan was saying, it's almost extreme in France that you have this very selection-oriented marking system where getting 20 out of 20 is almost impossible. Getting 0 is easy. You need 10 to pass, but it's all about who gets the highest marks. And so it becomes very competitive at a very early age, which is bad. So kids have a real fear of exams, and I think the psychological issue of exams is very important here, and one obviously we need to take into account. So 2 other points. One of them is, so do you abolish them? Now, I come at this with a perspective that if you are just teaching and learning for exams, that's bad. But exams can be markers of your own progress. If they enable you to see how you're doing, to place yourself among your peer group, and to see how you yourself are progressing or not, that can be an important tool for teaching and for learning. But if it's really just about you've got to pass this exam, then that is not a good tool, and in fact it's not good education. It's not a good performance judge. It's not good for learning either, because you're just learning the things that you're going to be asked about. So do you abolish or not? I think the real issue here is, let's not look at the past, let's look forward. What are the skills that you're going to need in the future, not just to get into university, but for life, at a time when robots and automation are becoming more and more important, where rote learning is something that actually is less important because machines can do these things better. So what you need at school and at university is to develop those critical skills, to develop that sense of discernment and judgment, to develop the social and emotional skills, which will be the keys for future employment. And the question there is, do exams really work in terms of testing those? My answer is, to a very limited degree, that actually exams are good for progress, for sensing where you are, but they're not going to help you really acquire those skills that you're going to desperately need in the future, in this this new world of automation.
Peter, thank you so much for that. Thank you for that contribution. I think that particularly that last point's really interesting. I'd love to hear some of the audience's reflections on that last point. What do exams not tell us about? Ready to talk next. Finn, are you there?
Yes, thank you. So first, I'd like to say, I think.
Hi.
Oh, can you hear me? Sorry. Oh, okay. So I'd like to say first, I think it's a really good question.
Try once more. It seems incredibly patchy. Some people are coming in and out. Try again, Finn.
How's that? Any better?
Good.
Yeah, you hear me now?
Go for it, Finn.
Excellent. Okay. So I think it's a really good question. Should we abolish exams? It's a big provocative question. I think one thing we haven't really looked at is actually, if you did it, what would you have instead? So if you look all the way back to how exams came about, they're probably one of the most interesting bits of policy borrowing, in that if you trace them in Western countries, a lot of it goes back to the imperial examination system in China. And they were brought in partly to replace the system of sort of patronage and networks and who you know with something more objective. And I think if we were really going to get rid of them, we'd need a good idea of what you would get that wasn't that. Because I don't think anyone wants to go back to a system of, are you the right type of person? Do you fit? Do you know all the right people? And they're you in for a job. So I think we've touched on some of the big issues around kind of fairness and well-being, and the fact that they don't necessarily measure what we want them to measure. But I think if we want to have a really effective system that is fair to all candidates, and puts people in the right places, because exams are a huge placement the placement effect, I think, is done picked up. They're a huge determinant of where people end up in life. So if we were going to get rid of them, I think we'd need to have a really good idea of how we're going to make sure that the new system would not have the adverse effects of exams, but also be fair to people and make sure that people end up where they should be on their merits, rather than it just being patronage and networks.
I'm having problems with my Wi-Fi. I'm going to hand over to James. I'm not even sure that you can hear me, but James is going to take over. I'm so sorry.
Finn, thanks, Polly. By the way, just so you know, there's an irony here, because I hope you can hear me, Finn. smile if you can.
Okay.
Yes, there you are. Well, I hope everyone can. It's almost always my Wi-Fi that goes down, so the irony is going to be not lost on my colleagues. But Phil, the one thing listening to you that, and actually from Dylan from the start and Peter too, is we're talking a lot about the institutional needs of exams, i.e. workplaces, societies, in schools as well. There's obviously a big emotional mental strain around exams and who we think that the exam system punishes and who it favors given that mental strain. I'm just interested to know what you think on that.
So on the mental strain, I think there are certain people for whom it works better and worse, and actually the equalities impact of that. So I think we've got good evidence that, for example, coursework tends in general to favour female students and exams tend to favour male students. So I think there's no kind of neutral way of doing this. I think one thing it's worth looking at is the degree to which an exam actually reflects what people need to do and what they've learned. And I think, you know, we've picked out some of the ways in which it doesn't, that, you know, you spend 3 years learning something and then you try and condense it all down into sitting down with a piece of paper and writing what you know for 3 hours. But I think it's also worth saying that they are very pressured, but there can be an advantage in that if people are then going to go on to the workplace, the job interviews, you know, this is a very kind of, think about economic ends of education, but the ability to deal with extremely high pressure situations and having exposure to that, I think there is some validity in that.
Right. Can I think there is. I think that what you just said is so, you know, significant in terms of who it advantages and who it disadvantages. And I just wondered, you know, one of the arguments for exams, and if I can, I'd like to bring back Dylan, if it's possible, and bring in some of the others making such interesting comments in the chat. But Dylan, one of the arguments that's upheld exams, or if you like, one of the central ones, is that at least it's a reliable and standard measure of the student, and that other measures, either because their assessments by teachers are inevitably, you know, can be impressionistic or unreliable, and can't be thought to be measuring like for like across different schools and different geographies. So if you were to move to a more mixed model where you had more emphasis on assessment, more in line with the 4 objectives of education that you talked about at the start, how could you ensure that the assessment system feels standardized and reliable?
We don't. And that's the point I was trying to make about trade-offs. If you wanted a reliable system, let's measure the student's height. We can measure that very reliably. It just doesn't mean anything in terms of their educational potential. So what I'm suggesting is that by moving right towards the end with time-written examinations that don't even assess the national curriculum, because speaking and listening is not assessed, because scientific investigation isn't assessed, we've narrowed down on the things, and we basically prioritized reliability over everything else. And what I'm suggesting is we need a recalibration. We need to actually say, we'll tolerate a bit of ambiguity because we actually need to be assessing the things that are genuinely useful. And in this regard, it's very important to recognize that A-levels are not that accurate. A-level grades are only accurate plus or minus 1 grade. And to make it really more accurate so that hardly any kid got misclassified, you would need to spend about 40 hours assessing each kid. So any assessment is a trade-off between accuracy, reliability, meaningfulness, and all those kinds of things. And what I'm saying is we need a debate about whether we're willing to carry on paying the price for an examination system that so clearly prioritizes reliability. The other thing I was going to say is, in moving the debate forward, it's really important to distinguish between what psychometricians call construct relevance and construct irrelevant variance. So the fact that some people—
Hang on, Dylan, hang on. You're going to have to say that again and slowly.
I know, I'm going to unpack it for you now.
Okay, good.
So basically, okay. The fact that some people do better on exams is okay if they're really better at the things that the exam is meant to be measuring. That's relevant to the construct you're measuring. But too often, exams are measuring things like confidence that are not relevant to the thing you're measuring. And that's why, you know, that's the debate between coursework and exams. So the question is the differences that we're seeing in the scores or the grades on the exams tightly related to the differences in the thing that it's meant to be measuring? And my criticism of exams is it's too easy to get a good score by only focusing on very small aspects of the subject. So the variation in the scores does not reflect the variation in talent in the students that are taking. And that's why exams are limited. And that's why we need broader sources of evidence.
And just to drill into that. So let's say we move to a world where we do accept a higher level of ambiguity. How does the world of work, because I can see you're saying that the world of work essentially is getting too much out of the education system, or at least is driving outcomes at the expense of other interests. But the world of work might say to you, all right, if we deliver a system that has a higher level of ambiguity in it, right, for which some people might say a lack of reliability, how does the world of work say, okay, fine, you're not going to just measure memory or attainment or what you've learned, but attributable skills in the workplace, like attitude, like teamwork, but in a way that is not as, concrete or as specific. How do you plan? How do you build for that?
Well, you don't. You let them decide. So right now, when we actually try to get everybody on a single continuum, the examination agency decides on the weightings for the different components. And because human beings are multidimensional, what I'm suggesting is we should have a multidimensional report, and different end users, universities or employers, can choose different weights for the things that they think are more or less important. And then they can get much more useful and accurate information for their specific purpose. But that's their job, not the schools.
Right. I just want to quote for you, just because I think it's a brilliant quote that Theodore Harris has just dropped into the chat. It comes from a book called The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin, and the quote is, "He was appalled by the examination system when it was explained to him. He could not imagine a greater deterrent to the natural wish to learn than this pattern of cramming in information and disgorging it at demand." So I just thought it was a wonderfully pithy way of putting that feeling. I'd love to bring in, if I can, a few people. There are a number of people who've got their hands up. Lauren Dogood and Birna Helgertier, I hope I pronounced your name right, Birna, and Alan too, I'd love to bring back in. And also I'm aware that Adele Fairclough has essentially been making the same point. So I'm hoping that I can bring some of you, Birna, why don't we start with you if you're there? Have you got a camera on? No. Okay. Well, let's go with Lauren. Lauren, hello. Well,
good morning.
Good morning.
So I'm Lauren. I'm from Leicestershire. I wanted to really go back to the point on who do exams benefit, because I think the real kind of thing here is that exams, in the most part, are not benefiting the young people that are taking them. They're benefiting the schools and the wider system, because as we've already touched on, the exams are not teaching the right skills. They're teaching how to tick boxes, and because of this, schools are so focused on getting good grades that they're not teaching the things that aren't assessed. Because if they can't get a good grade in it, why does it matter if their students are good members of their community, are prepared for later life? Because that's not reflected in their grading.
Yes.
In exam like grades and in school rankings, which are based on them.
And what do you make of the point that Finn was making, that yes, look, there are clearly problems with the exam system and who it favors, but the process of learning for exams, and yes, even the pressure that comes with, is actually useful in terms of training for later life. What do you make of that, Lauren?
I think that maybe exams do teach good skills, as in sometimes, yes, in work you'll have to do things that you don't want to. You will have to work under deadlines. But I think that the mental health problems that it causes a large percentage of young people is not worth that. Right. And also, so I have done work with the UK Youth Parliament, who have a massive campaign on a curriculum for life, which I do suggest everyone goes and looks at. which kind of highlights how different skills should be being taught, especially in like non-traditional subjects for people who may not want to follow like going to uni path, those traditional education routes.
Yes. Well, Lorna, I will ask. I'm going to make a little plug here, if I can, for the Tortoise app, because we've got a library where we're trying to pull together all of the best writing and thinking. And so, if you can, Lauren, bring in from your plug into the Tortoise app and plug in that document, we're going to try and collate all the best thinking that's out there, and that sounds like it's essential. I'm going to move on just because we're running out of time, and given I didn't have a great record at the start in keeping to time, I'm going to try and do better in this session. Alan, I'm going to bring you in, and then I'm going to go back to Peter Gumble in a second, if I may. Just Alan, what do you think?
So I think exams serve a particular function in the sense that if we say that all knowledge is essentially modeling, right? What exams allow you to do is essentially test your model of a particular subject, and essentially what it allows you to do is test your model against basically it allows you to see what you know and don't know, right?
Yes.
In the sense that you build up a model or framework of a particular subject, and then you evaluate that model based on and you apply that model to an exam, and then what you're able to do is then see what your model is missing and see what your model does actually have. So
sorry, forgive me for interrupting, Alan. Your model in the education system is missing, or your model in the individual is missing?
In the sense that all knowledge is modeling. So basically, I think in terms of say for example physics, right? You build up a model or framework of concepts, right? And you apply that concept, and then when it comes to an exam, you apply that framework to a problem. And if you get the problem correct, then your model is probably correct. And if you get it wrong, your model is probably missing something, right? So in terms of a learning tool, it's a great way for you to sort of like a natural selection mechanism where it allows you to keep what's good and add on things that you're missing. So I think as a learning tool, it's great. But I think as I mentioned earlier, I think the American system is actually superior in the sense that going to the to the argument of standardized testings versus something like a grade point average. I think grade point averages promote the idea that someone should work hard across his across the educational cycle, whereas exams really encourage you to whereas standardized exams at the end of a education cycle really encourage you to essentially just cram and really instead of thinking. And that's not, I don't think that's I don't think that's how life works. I think we should probably encourage people to work hard across a period of time instead of during specific chunks of time because of a test. So I think the American system is really superior in that sense. But as mentioned before, they lack there is a trade-off. But I think what's great about the American system in that respect is that they have they do have standardized testing in the form of SATs and SAT subject tests. So I think really I think right now we focus too much on testing at the end of an education cycle, which isn't really conducive to building students are able to solve problems when the domain isn't particularly laid out.
So, Alan, I'm going to interrupt you just because we're running short of time, but I also really take your point. We've talked about the disadvantages of the exam system as regards certain people. We haven't talked about, in the way you touched upon, how it sort of tilts time, how you as you say, cram in some periods and may take it easy in others. Peter, but there are a number of hands up, so I'm going to come to Lorna Unwin and Jenny Lawrence in a second. But I'm just interested to know, if you had a blank sheet of paper, given what you've seen in the UK and in France and Europe more generally, what would your system be?
Well, I think, I've also lived and worked in the US, and the US system is not a model that people should follow anyway. I think the SATs are now in disrepute in many places. I think some people are getting it right. I think the International Baccalaureate has a good mixture of coursework and exams, so you can show how well you can do over a period of 2 years, and then you sort of really show again with the final exams. And that's a good balance, I think. But what I find intriguing is, particularly in the US, actually, they're looking at alternative credentialing systems. So essentially, employers looking for other signs than just school or university. We've seen that even in France, for example. There's the best software school in France is called 42, and they take people who have to spend 3 days or 4 days showing their skills in a team with others. So that's not exam based. That's just a very intensive period where you spend a few days showing off what you can do, but also how well you can work in a team and whether you'd fit in. So people are trying to do different approaches, but these are mainly employers, and we're at a very early stage. The whole discussion around credentialing in the US is just starting and hasn't really picked up, I think, in Europe nearly as much. So in short, IB, International Baccalaureate for a school, is, I think, a good balance. It shows that you can mark your progress with the exams, but you can also mark your progress with coursework. And then beyond that, getting away from the tyranny of even a university degree as a determinant of your job qualifications, that's also an important next step.
Okay, brilliant. Well, listen, I'm going to hear from a couple of others. Jenny Lawrence. Are you there, Jenny? Hello.
Yes. Oh, can you hear me?
I can. You're there. All there.
About the IB, because I've been through 5 education systems growing up, and the IB stuck out as one that was really rather inclusive and was focusing more on transferable skills. I mean, the middle years program that was essentially middle school was crossing subjects, and I think there was a really nice balance between sort of having assessments that were slightly more formal and having the formative assessments that were slightly more just to see your more general progress. And on top of that, you had the which I remember incredibly vividly, the parent-teacher conferences where the students would be leading what they had learned in that term. And I think that was a really, really beneficial thing, because you were able to stand on your own 2 feet and say, as I don't know, what was I was 11 years old at the time, and say to my parents and my teachers, this is what I learned this term. This was really beneficial for me. I found that I really progressed in these areas. And I think particularly in younger years, that kind of, bringing yourself to actually say, this is what I developed, and, being aware of your own progress was really, really valuable. And then I did GCSEs, and then I went back to the IB diploma. And I remember the teachers at my school, which was an English school at the time, they were so keen. So many of them lined up to want to learn how to teach the IB, because they saw it as such a beneficial system that sort of taught a more all-round education with less focus on exams.
Okay, but Jenny, that's what's wonderful about these things is you suddenly hear sometimes these really small examples of what can work. You think, oh yeah, we should really do that. So you should see, as you were speaking, people weighing in saying how brilliant it is, particularly that that student teacher conference you mentioned.
Yeah.
I'm going to hear if we've got. I think we've got time for one more thought from Lorna Unwin. Lorna, if you're there, there you are. Yes, hello.
Hello. Yes, can you hear me?
Very well.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, it just because of time, I'm involved in a Nuffield funded project looking at the impact on 16-year-olds who don't get grade C or grade 4 in GCSE maths and English. And it kind of links to Jenny's, the last point that Jenny made, which is what we're finding is the concentration on the importance of that maths and English pass rate, which now so dominates the GCSE system in England, means that a lot of the young people we've been talking to, they have disregarded all the subjects that they've actually got passes in, or have done reasonably well in. And so the exams, because of the focus on the maths and English threshold, means students don't seem to have a language to talk about their capabilities. So it leaves them feeling incredibly lacking in confidence for any post-16 education or workplace training. So I think that's a damaging effect. But on the other hand, I think what we're trying to do is place this within a historical context of how thresholds have been developed in England since the 19th century. And what you find are various attempts to try and develop the kind of record of achievement approach I think that Dylan is talking about, and which I would certainly support. But of course, what kicks in all the time is the state's notion of wanting to measure school efficiency, and the kind of competition element. So I think we have to look at why exams are so powerful for the state, as well as for the selecting institutions or employers.
It's such a massive point, this, isn't it? How often we find ourselves in defense of something that is in the institutional interest and not necessarily in the individual interest or the social interest. Lorna, thank you very much. As you can see, we have run out of time. I'm going to hand back to Polly, but before I do, I'm going to say two things. One is, there's a special pleasure in life when something is really good and it's got nothing to do with you, and this Education Summit is one of those examples, chiefly because Polly Curtis has been the great driver of making it happen. So one was just to say thank you to you, Polly, for that. And the second thing I've had nothing to do with is the extraordinary functions in our app that mean that you can continue the chat, you can share the documentation, and I hope that what we can do is not just corral the conversation that's happening in the sort of video screens, but also all the conversation that's happening in text and in the research that's been done by others. So please do weigh in and be a part of that. But with that, Polly, I'm going to leave you the impossible task of having gone from a binary poll at the start to a really ambiguous, textured, layered conversation over the last 45 minutes, and ask you to wrap that up.
Thank you, James. The only thing I didn't sort out was my internet, so sorry about that. Thank you very much to all our speakers and everyone for contributing. I thought that was a fascinating illustration of really the pressures that are building on these kind of relatively simple processes of examining students to do lots of different things, to sort for universities, to judge schools, to sort for employers. There is a huge amount of pressure on this one process to serve a lot of systems, as Dylan was pointing out, and to judge schools as well. Russell's point about Ofsted looking at the results as well. And that pressure really builds up onto both the students and the teachers. We heard some really interesting examples, I think, of better ways of doing things. In the chat, there was a lot of talk about the IB and whether that is a better way of doing things, standardized testing in America for selecting for university, and Jenny's example of student-led conferences. That's something we'll definitely look at as we take our reporting forward. But I think the thing that's ringing in my ears at the end of this is Dylan's call for a sensible conversation, that there is not going to be a perfect system in this. What are the trade-offs? How do we make those decisions to trade off between the various kind of pressures on this system? So just to say thank you very much for everyone for joining. Do join us for the next session at 11 o'clock, where we'll be talking about the curriculum of the future and what it needs to include. Thanks very much, James, for stepping in. See you later.